Now, Raina Andrews, Director of Community Impact at Feeding America Eastern Wisconsin, will introduce our speaker.
Thank you. Thank you, President Steve. Good afternoon. How's everyone feeling? Good. You should feel really, really pumped because today's speaker is someone who I have a tremendous amount of respect for, who I really admire, and a group of Rotarians had an opportunity to go to dinner with him last night. Do we have any of the Rotarians who went to dinner last night in the room? Karen, Maggie? Yes. And so you really get to know a person's character when you begin to understand their philosophies on life. And it was very evident that our keynote speaker today, our guest speaker, is social justice through and through. I got a chance to meet him last year at the NAACP Freedom Fund dinner in Ozaukee County. I was wowed then, and he is a phenomenal speaker, so you're in for a treat today. So today's speaker is Xavier Ramey, who is the CEO of Justice Informed. Justice Informed is a national social impact consulting firm in Chicago, Illinois. Xavier was a part of the Black Lives Matter, which is aligned with Let Us Breathe Collective. He is a Rotarian of the Proviso Rotary Club in Maywood, Illinois. He was a speaker at the Rotary International Peace Building Conference and has spoken at the Rotary International Convention. I can't think of anyone better to address us today to talk about towards a more inclusive Rotary. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our speaker for today, Xavier Ramey.
Hey everybody. Come on. Hi, everyone. I appreciate that. My name's Xavier Ramey. Raina, thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. To all those who joined me at dinner last night, I do appreciate the time. I appreciate the perspective and being able to not only hear about your thoughts about the city of Milwaukee, but also about some of the opportunities and challenges that exist within your own Rotary Club and within Rotary International and our global membership here. So I'm going to jump right in. The title of my talk was Towards a More Inclusive Rotary. I don't usually title my talks. I don't do PowerPoint presentations. I like to speak from the heart, and I like to speak from the energy that I feel from people when I enter a room and am able to converse with them a bit. I was born in Chicago, Illinois. And show of hands, who's heard of Chicago? Yeah, folks heard of Chicago. When you think of Chicago, you think of a couple things. You might think of the Millennium Park, the Magnificent Mile. You think about the Chicago Bulls and Michael Jordan. You think about old Mayor Daley and younger Mayor Daley and Rahm Emanuel and all the mayors that we've had. You think about the architecture. You think about the river and the lake. You think about the geographic design and groundbreaking city and urban planning. And this, on the social side, for some of those who really know the history, you think about the fight for labor reform. You think about the Haymarket riots and the fight for an 8-hour workday. You recall that it was there in the Democratic National Convention of 1968 that a city was exposed for the inherent segregation and racism that it persisted and tolerated at a time when people fought not only for justice, but for the honesty and truth-telling in a country that said it was already honest and true. Many of the realities of our day that we speak about and consider today in my city extend to the realities across the country. These are not things that anyone can hide from given the current climate of our political discussion, given the challenges within our institutions, whether they be corporate or nonprofit or foundation. We are all considering what does it mean to be a diverse and equitable and inclusive organization. We think about our communities and the realities of a city like Milwaukee and Chicago not being very far behind and being labeled as one of the most segregated cities in the country. The entrenched issues of not only racial inequity, but gender inequity and pay wages and the challenges that LGBTQIA persons deal with and fight with just to be themselves every day, to wake up and feel safe in a country that said they were already protected under one flag for all. This is the reality of what we are faced with right now. And when I think about Rotary, I think about what does it mean to have a global force of over 1 million people who have collectively said they are committing not only to serve, but to consider. I want to anchor a little bit on what it means to consider. I run a social impact consulting firm. That's a new type of company that just came around in the last couple of years. Much like the world of diversity, equity, inclusion, this is a very nascent field. It exists, I think, because as someone who grew up as the child of philanthropy, I grew up in the nonprofits that a lot of Rotarians likely donated to. As a child of philanthropy, I grew up and I got to see what a country was, what a people were, what a city was through the lens of benevolence. And at the same time, I was fed a doctrine of self-determination, that I had to work hard, had to fight for it, had to want it, had to demand it, had to be clear about what I wanted, to be clear in my ambitions, and dedicated in my discipline to get to whatever I got. And if I got to it in this country, then that was the American dream. And that was fruit and evidence of the promise of a country, of a nation, of the opportunity when people come together. What they don't talk about is all the stuff that's in the middle, between you and your dream. All the things that you fight for. What they don't say when we talk about giving back is how much people take first. When we think about the reality of charity, we never think about it through the lens of what Dr. King said when he said that philanthropy is commendable, but it cannot cause the philanthropist to forget the things that cause the need for philanthropy. The underlying root causes that our cities and countries are based upon. The reality of generational harm, bad public policy, not just public policy. The definition of violence being one that is extended only to the physical body and not to the reality of what public policy can do to generations of children who grow up with underfunded or unfunded schools. This is the world I was born into, in Chicago, Illinois. My company, Justice Informed, I like to think the reason why we exist and the reason why we do what we do in the world of diversity, equity, inclusion, equity and public policy-focused corporate social responsibility, equity-focused philanthropy, and community engagement is because it is time to acknowledge that we are in a transition moment in our country, we are in a transition moment in our world, and our institutions must also transition. What do I mean by transition? What I mean is that the folks who didn't get to talk before can now speak. It's a paradigm that is creating incredible shifts and conflict in our cities and in our communities. My father created a company called Sustainable Communities and Associates. It was a social impact consulting firm. But he did it at a time when that was not possible. It was not tenable to do that with a level of safety. Last night I was talking about how, we grew up quite hungry and we grew up poor. And I remember the winter that we didn't have heat because he didn't have enough money to hire lawyers when people didn't honor his contracts and they paid us with deer because they were hunters. And so all we had that winter was deer. I hate venison, by the way. You ever had deer omelet? It's rough. But for everyone who says, just fight it in court, just fight it in court, that doesn't understand the realities of poverty, that to fight it in court is an economic privilege in a world where we don't encourage our children to be public defenders. We encourage them to be contract lawyers. We encourage them to go to higher paying fields. In a world committed to charity where we don't encourage our children to be more like Martin Luther King, and most of our foundations would never even fund them in the first place. That the reality of what it means to truly change a country, it requires not only acknowledging conflict and stepping into it, but understanding that conflict is what creates stronger relationships. It's the holding of the tension that defines who we are together. It's not what we choose and insist on forgetting about one another because we're different. It's the holding of our differences. And as someone who's been able to grow up in a time where I have more of a modicum of safety than my father did, I insist on speaking. And so my message has been pretty clear. And the beauty of being able to create a company that holds that message, that challenges companies, that embraces them, that looks at the twin anchors of relational specificity, meaning that we center the most marginalized, not only in our decisions and how we organize power, but in how we speak about what has happened. And the other great pillar of invitation. Knowing that it's very difficult to convince someone to engage an idea or to be involved in a new type of action that fundamentally changes the way that they're able to perceive their lives, the way that they see their neighbors, the way that they understand their own history, requires that someone model that more benevolent, truly honest, and honestly friendly way of living. You see, I'm committed to anti-racism, and I know I live in a country that is not. Just last week, I was looking at, it was a couple days ago, Target is embroiled right now because a black woman was on their diversity. They made a commercial about diversity and how they're supporting small business entrepreneurs. And this black woman made a statement. She said, I do this because I want more young black women to know that they can be entrepreneurs too. And the internet lit her up. They lit her up. She's a racist. She said she's doing this for black people. To talk about race is racism. That's how the conversation goes in a lot of Rotary clubs I've been in. To even bring up the topic of harm is seen as a form of harm, but the harm itself is left unindicted. James Baldwin, he said at one point, he said, it is the innocence which constitutes the crime, that all of this can happen and people can walk away innocent. As poverty and harm perpetuates our cities and segregation persists, that those who perpetuate it can walk away innocent. The innocence is what constitutes the crime. This is the reality of where we're at. When I think about something he said around, who should be the ones who evaluates us? And he looked at this notion of justice and he said, if you truly want to know what justice is in a country, you don't ask a police officer. You don't ask a lawyer. You don't ask a judge. He said, ask the black man, ask the Mexican, ask the Puerto Rican, ask the gay woman how the wretched fare in the halls of justice, and they will tell you not just whether or not a country is just, but whether it has any love or concept of it. And it is true in any case that ignorance, allied with power, is the greatest threat that justice can ever have. You see, by ignoring the realities of what we've inherited, which create the opportunities that we have today, by ignoring them, we perpetuate the types of harm that have created the systemic nature of violence that we experience today. That when we look across town and we see an entire neighborhood that's not only segregated, but also poor, that doesn't just happen. That doesn't just happen. As someone who grew up in those types of neighborhoods, I can tell you, we did not just happen. And there is not a lack of will in many places that would love to be in rooms like these. It is not for a lack of will. It is for lack of opportunity and honesty about the severity of harm that they fight against. Now, I believe in my heart of hearts that people come to Rotary because they have a conviction to change the world. Not only that they have the hope that they as an individual have enough to make a difference. That's an incredible hope. When you have that level of hope and that level of ambition, and you have enough people in a room to come together and say, as we were just talking about, to raise $250,000 for a project in a year, this is the reality of the ambition of the organization of you all's intent. Now, the question there is, what is the responsibility to extend that capacity to things we truly need? I joined Rotary about 2.5 years ago. I did not join Rotary because I wanted to be a Rotarian. I joined Rotary because I saw what it was building. When I joined the Maywood and Proviso Rotary, it was because I saw a club that was mostly white in a neighborhood that was mostly black, and I couldn't believe it. For the same reasons, when I went to church in Chicago and I went to this church called Park, and I could not believe that in the shadows of Cabrini Green, where I had lived for several years in the projects, they had built an entire church in what used to be an entirely black neighborhood, and it was like 90% white. I could not believe that in the 21st century we were still building racially homogenous institutions, racially homogenous communities. I could not believe in the 21st century, when we had the opportunity to do it differently, we did not become what we've been called to replace. I could not believe it. But here we were. And the message that I was given was to endure this. It was not to engage it, it was to endure it. Every day that we don't commit to a more rigorous form of diversity and inclusion is a day that we insist on people who have been harmed and segregated out of our rooms to endure us. It is a demand for endurance which we have no right to give. In the face of what we say our ambitions are, we have no right to demand endurance of people who are already wearied in this country. The reason why I didn't start a nonprofit and I started a company, a for-profit company, was because I knew that in the nonprofit world, the for-profit world thinks of social good as just something good to do sometimes, and that's not a good way to build your platform. To be seen as the charitable deduction, to be seen as the set-aside, to be seen as the 10% once I'm done with my 90, to be seen as the volunteer hour and not the 9 to 5, to be seen as the second and never the first. To create a platform that's seen as such would never allow for me to truly exercise the intentions that I had, the desires that I had for true relationship, which is what I'm calling for right now. And I hope you understand it to be as such. I'm not calling to indict, I'm not calling to challenge, I'm calling to bring people higher into a form of relationship that this country has never known. A deeper, more proximate relationship that doesn't ignore the realities of our skin color, doesn't ignore the realities of our economic differences, and does not ignore the differences in our gender. It respects and understands, and it allocates resources according to what is needed, not just on the notion of some minuscule definition of fairness, but true equity, meaning that each produces relative to their capacity, and they are given relative to their need. That's a country I want to live in. And if you're one of the largest non-governmental funders on the planet, which is what Rotary is, then that's where the work starts. That's where the work starts. In 2016, Rotary took a census of its membership and found that 1.2 million members had left Rotary and 1.2 million members had joined in the span of 8 years. Out of 1.3 million global members, they had nearly had an entire flip. People in, people out. And some stalwarts who remained. When you talk to the folks at RI about the growth that they're seeing right now in Africa and Asia and how Rotary is growing exponentially there and how it's dwindling here in the US, when you go to Evanston, Illinois, and you talk to the folks at RI and you really dig into why is membership growing in Asia and Africa, and why is it dwindling here in the US? I think it's dwindling here in the US for many of the reasons that I experience when I go around to different clubs around the country. We insist on not speaking about what divides us. And we insist on not coming to terms with the opportunities that exist when we engage that. We insist on allowing the guys who've been in the room for the last 30 years and giving generously and often, and never critiquing the means of production by which their charity was created, but appreciating the benevolence of the charity that is extended. Rather than looking at those who can't afford to meet, those who can't take off the time, and reorganizing our frameworks and our systems to accommodate those who do not have the capacity and do have the need. It's a choice, y'all. It's a choice. It's a choice. The one thing I learned when I worked in Ethiopia was that the way we live in America is a choice. It's a tradition. And it's one that we revere. Last night at dinner, I talked about with Bob Iger, who's the former president of Disney. He gave this masterclass on the difference between respect and reverence. He said one of the greatest challenges you'll ever face when you're leading a massive institution is differentiating between what you respect about your institution versus what you revere. And he said, my company, Disney, almost collapsed because of what we revered. When you revere something, it's holy. You can't touch it. Anybody who talks about it, they don't understand you. They're not here to support. It's like when you take a knee for the flag. No one listens to why you did it because they revere the symbol. Whereas other people like myself, I did not put my hand to my chest when we just said the pledge. Of course I considered what it meant to honor and respect the room that I come into. Of course I considered that. But the terms of my presence come with the realities of my identity. And that's a statement that I have to make, and it's a conversation I hope to have with more people. The reality is that everyone doesn't see it the way that everyone else does. And that some of our traditions have inhibited us from extending empathy. By holding tight to our traditions, we've blocked the opportunity for community. By having things that we revere so deeply, that were created as reverent symbols by people who never included those who have no reverence for that symbol. That when those who've been excluded come in and say, I don't revere what you revere, would you consider what I have to say? We say, sit down, shut up. Don't hate the country. It's an incredible way to have a conversation. I found that conversation throughout Rotary clubs. That insistence on silence as a form of relationship. That insistence on transaction as a form of social good. The reality of not wearing a suit and being seen as unprofessional, when the reality was this shirt was designed by an African woman. And where she's from, this is a suit. But because of colonization, because of white supremacy, because of global issues that we see around assimilations and the demand for it, this level of professionalism is seen as casual. It's seen as unprofessional. And so the question that I look at is, what is my responsibility as a leader? It's to stand defiantly and say, I have to demonstrate, I have to model, we have to demonstrate, we have to model a different definition of normal. I hope one day that walking in with my boots and my jeans and this shirt, I'll be seen as one of the most capable and professional people you'll ever meet. That day is not today. Perhaps in this room, but I know that's not the case everywhere we go. I sent a text to one of my friends. He's the managing director of Northwestern Mutual. It's right up the street. I said, hey, I'm outside your headquarters. He said, oh, that's great. I'm with the home team down in Austin. I was like, oh, jeez. And I thought about what I was wearing. I thought, gosh, what would they think if I walked in there? What would they think if I walked in there with this on? You see, this is what people wear where you serve. This is what people wear where Rotarians serve. And if we can't see that as worthy of our highest honors, of our greatest form of access, of our highest definitions and standards of friendship and proximity, then we're doing it wrong. RI released a diversity, equity, inclusion statement last year. Anyone read it? A couple folks? I'm gonna assume a couple folks read it. This is a tense conversation, so I can understand if folks aren't raising their hands. They released a diversity, equity, inclusion statement. My club has been embroiled in some challenges around DEI. A lot of clubs have, around declining membership, around microaggressions in the club, around conversations and challenges that people have, around the age differences in clubs, around difference of abilities and accessibility of the locations that people have had for years that serve their lunch meetings. These are all persistent challenges in a lot of clubs. If you're experiencing them here, know that you are not alone. The reality is that as someone who does diversity, equity, inclusion work like 17 hours a day, I truly appreciate the intent and the work that RI and the International Board put behind that statement. I've read through the statement. I've read through every assessment tool that they have. I reread them over the last couple days. I read them again this morning. And I want to say that there's something more ambitious and more relational that you can ascribe to other than what we've been provided. I think that the diversity inclusion statement is a wonderful start. One of the things that I have to do in my line of work is I have to listen for fear, not to it. When I read something, I listen to hear what were they afraid of when they got this passed through all the folks who shot down the first 10 versions. That's what happens, y'all know that, right? When you're trying to get something through, it takes like 10 versions. People say, I don't want that line, I don't want that word. What does that word mean? Why do we have to say that out loud? If we say that, we'll piss that person off. If we don't add this in, we'll exclude them, and they've been given money. All that kind of stuff happens. And so you have to listen for fear, never to it. Because if you don't do the second part, that means you hold tightly to your ambition that got you in the fight in the first place. While you're listening for the fear to understand what they're bowing to, what they're willing to concede on, what they insist on not seeing and not hearing again. And so when I read it through, I could hear the fear. I know that the moment you bring up the word race in an international body, they'll say racism is an American issue. They have. That's been a conversation in Rotary. We should not talk about race because Race in America, one, is a heated conversation, and secondly, overseas, that's not the challenge. It's more about ethnicity and culture. You'll hear things like that. When you bring up matters of representation, Rotary put a 30% goal on gender representation as relates to women being parts of clubs. Global goal, 30%. It will be the only measurable goal you will see for any of the 4 impact areas that Rotary International has. It is the only measurable goal that they have provided any club. Meaning that we have goals and we have nothing to hold ourselves accountable by. You would have to individually as a club demarcate what your numbers would be, but once you say what your number is, I promise you someone's gonna say, so we're just letting anybody in? We're just gonna do the quota? We just want people for the sake of people? And that argument, it frustrates me because it ignores the reality that people are already capable and credible. They've simply been overlooked. For instance, here in the United States, we've never had a woman as president. Never. In the history of the country, there's never been a woman that's president. Does that mean that there's no woman in America right now that qualifies to be president? Or does that mean that the fellas haven't caught up? You telling me that there's no woman who's smart enough, no woman who's savvy enough, no woman with the political expertise, no woman with the legal background, no woman who's read constitutional law, no woman in the entire country who can do that job. It has less to do with women and it has more to do with men. Your work starts where your privilege starts. The reality of harm in America is that the only people that can set people free are the ones who already are. I'm a descendant of slaves in this country. My people could not set my people free. Only white folks who could vote could set slaves free. Which means is they would say it's not our work, that's a black issue, it is their work. Because they're the only ones that can do that work. They're the only ones who have the right to do it. By nature of the law itself. No woman could give herself the right to vote. The Equal Pay Act didn't pass because a bunch of women decided it would. It passed because a bunch of men put their weapons down and said, we insist on changing the definition of the workplace. And that for every woman who was the first in her workplace it had less to do with her brilliance and her tenacity and her creativity and more to do with the shift in the moral arc of the men who held the reins of leadership. That those who say LGBTQIA people, they're choosing, it's like they're just showing up everywhere. Not, they've always been there. It's just never been safe to say they were them. It's just never been safe. And people are finally a little bit safer, and they're still not safe. This is the transition moment that we're in the world right now. The children of philanthropy, those who've been on the outside, those who didn't get to write the laws and were never invited to write the Constitution, those that didn't get to be the beneficiaries of some of the greatest acts of welfare in the nation and our nation's history, like the Homestead Act, those people now have a voice. Those people now have laws that protect them, like the Civil Rights Act, like the Equal Pay Act, like the Community Reinvestment Act. These statutory regulations give opportunities to people who have always had a social claim to the country and have never had the legal right to exercise it. They can now speak, and they are speaking. One is speaking now. And they have something to say. And the beauty of our time is that we've inherited an opportunity that every generation has inherited and every generation has delegated. Every generation in the history of America has had the opportunity to form a more proximate, systemic relationship with the other. And every generation has delegated it to the next. And this is the opportunity again. We climb that tree, we climb that mountain again, and we see whether this is one nation under all. Our Rotary clubs can be ground zero for modeling. They can be the place, the playground for ideas and expressions and new types of relationships, or not. I speak with an urgency that reflects the urgency of my identity. I don't intend to go back to what I grew up in. That is why I speak like this. I speak directly and clearly, and I don't want to be misunderstood. And I think that's where we need to get more in line with that. To be okay with holding the tension of our differences. To hear language like this as a call to relationship and not an indictment of our history. That's the difficulty. That's the difficulty. If you walk away from this conversation today and you say, man, that guy was, whew, he was mad. You missed it. You missed it. He was excited to be a type of friend we've never known. He was so excited, he spoke to us honestly. He didn't hide 1 inch of himself. You know, if you can't say the word justice, you certainly can't do the work of it. I run the only company in America, LLC, with the word justice in the title. Because people don't think of corporate enterprise and think justice. It was really hard to find that website. Really easy, rather. It was really easy to name it. I sat down at my desk when I was working at the University of Chicago, and I got home one day, and I knew I had this thing in my heart I had to let out. I knew I had it in there. And I thought, what should inform us? And I thought, what has been informing me? Marketing has informed me. The bottom line has informed me. Membership has informed me. So many things have informed us, but what would it be if justice informed us? What would it be like to live in a country where we weren't afraid of talking about who we've been? We were more excited about talking about who we were going to be. I have no idea what that country looks like. I have no idea what that conversation sounds like when everybody's in on it. I know that the majority of my time is spent trying to tamper down the fears that people have about losing a little bit of their everything, about making space for people who have always been present and never heard, about creating definitions because the people who made them never included us when they defined things. That's what gets me excited. That's why I joined Rotary. That's also why our club memberships are dwindling, because we can't engage that. And I promise you, I'm not the only one who feels like this. There's a generation behind me that feels like this, that have no problem dealing with the tensions of our differences, that don't mind taking a hit and not calling it a hit, of taking a risk and not calling it a risk, knowing that all it is a new form, a higher form, a deeper form of relationship and friendship that we said we already had in the first place. They're ready, they're coming, and you can leave it on the table if you want. I'm trying really doggone hard to make sure that Rotary doesn't leave it on the table. This is an opportunity. This is an opportunity. This is an opportunity. This is not a challenge. This is an opportunity. See it as such, please. This is an opportunity to honestly be what we kept saying we already were. We have to turn the evaluation around and let those who are the wretched say how they fare in the halls of justice. I appreciate your time. Feel free to reach out. I know that there are many companies that are dealing with these issues day to day, from their supply chains over to their talent management ideas and challenges to the issues in the C-suite and boards of directors. We deal with them all the time. I've dealt with everything from the Trump administration to the Klan to you name it in my line of work. I don't run away from a fight because the fights I deal with are always calls into friendship. And so if you have questions, or if you need advice, or you're looking for a real type of engagement, let me know. I appreciate you all. I'm open for questions. I think we've got about 10 minutes for questions. Thank you. If you have a question, just raise your hand. Let me know what your name is. I think most folks are members of the Rotary. I know you also have guests sometimes. If you're a guest, let me know. And I'd love to take your questions. Yes, ma'am.
How much do you think guilt gets in the way of being able to talk honestly?
How much do I think guilt gets in the way of being able to talk honestly? I think it gets in the way a lot. A lot of people are, they feel guilty about things and they haven't processed them. The reality, when I was working at the University of Chicago, I learned pretty quickly that when people avoid conversations about social interaction and the history of a country and what the other might call it versus what the majority would call it, they show up unprepared for conversations. There's a level of emotional dexterity and conversational fluency that's required to have these types of conversations. And that's a challenge because you have to like do it a bit. If you think about, for instance, I failed one class in my life, and that was chemistry. I was terrible at chemistry. The reason why I was terrible at chemistry was because I had one part of it called stoichiometry. I don't know what it is today, but it's called stoichiometry, and I was pretty bad at it. I also didn't practice much. I didn't actually do all the work. I didn't do a lot of the homework. I didn't show up prepared. I wasn't really listening in class, and I failed the class. And I had to take night school. That's how people show up to conversations on race. That's how people show up to conversations on gender. They have not read one book. They've not considered, not actually gone to source material. They've not actually talked to a trans person. And they show up ready to fight with no tools. And they know they're exposed. They know they don't have it. That's why I said one of the greatest things that I get to do that I appreciate is I'm just trying to push people to consider. I'm not trying to win you over and tell you what to do and how to live your life. I'm just trying to say, can you consider? And the thing that gets people to considering is blocking that push towards feeling guilt. And like I was saying, looking at it not as a challenge, this work ahead of us, not as a challenge, but as an opportunity. You have to reframe it away from guilt. The notion of guilt is a self-centered thing in the first place, right? Like guilt is looking in yourself and seeing a lack of capacity in the face of what you knew should have happened. Guilt happens when you knew you had resources, you knew you had the ability, or you were deprived of the ability and still showed up, and there's expectation that you were different. And now you feel bad about it. There was an expectation that you'd feel different, and you either didn't have the opportunity or you did have the opportunity and you blew it. That is a wholly useless feeling in conversations about relationship. Acknowledgement. In the four-way test, the first thing is it true? In 2018, when I took the stage at Rotary International's convention in Toronto, one of the hardest things I had to say was the litany of examples that I gave about my country and saying, is it true? I wanted to stand on that. And the notion of guilt rests on your ability to say whether it was true or not. And that's often what people are wrestling against. They're wrestling against saying, this happened, it had an effect, and I might have had something to do with it. Or what I've inherited had something to do with it, and I've built, in the last years of my life, I've built something off of what I inherited that I know everyone didn't have an opportunity to have. And that if the playing field was leveled, the chips might not have fallen how they have. But I think guilt gets in the way a lot. I also think it's a very useless feeling in these conversations. Yes?
So you talk about what you're seeing as differences across the generations and the perspectives.
Differences that I'm seeing across the generations and perspectives about what? Oh, about identity theory, these types of things? Yeah, it's really interesting. Generationally, there's this expectation that millennials and the Gen Zers are like, they get it, right? But every generation, when I was, every generation was the they get it generation. Right? Like I'm pretty sure when the Generation Xers were around and they were seen as the renegades and Kurt Cobain and all of this type of, like they were, they care. They're gonna fight for it. And there's this moment, this is what I was saying around the generational challenge. We have the opportunity we've always inherited and always delegated. Every generation has had the opportunity to be that one sacrificial generation that cared so much that they didn't just take what they were given, they invested what they were given in people who didn't have a chance. And people keep kicking that can. We kick it as a generation. We don't just kick it individually, we kick it together. That's the challenge. I have a lot of hope for every next generation. Every next generation, I find, deals a little bit easier. So for instance, I have this argument a lot with, I have a lot of boomer friends and a lot of Gen X friends. I have this challenge with them, specifically like around gender equity. And I don't mean gender equity like women, right? The gender equity conversation around women has mostly just benefited white women. And the challenge with that is many women of color have been left completely out. But the moment you start talking about that, partly because of where people choose to live later in life, particularly if you're higher income, you usually self-segregate. The segregation isn't deemed to be intentionally racial, but it is racialized because economics is racialized, because the labor market is racialized. You wouldn't have diversity and inclusion if the labor market was not racialized. And so these downstream effects create an ability to have a conversation differently, but there's a resistance because there's not a history with folks. So when I was at the University of Chicago and I was teaching social justice and I ran their social innovation strategy, I saw a bunch of young people who were always around people who were different from them. Even though the University of Chicago is not a terribly diverse school, it was diverse enough to create a conversation. And that conversation was important, and I would always challenge the students, and I would say, look, if what happened to me is pretty standard, it's gonna happen to you. And what happened to me was I went to college in the early 2000s. I graduated college in the early 2000s. And I had all these people of color and women and people from around the country. They were all in my classes. And 10 years later, all the discrimination levers of society kicked in. And then all the rooms I were in, they weren't there anymore. And we had a bunch of people who were the tokens, the onlys. And it only took 10 years for people to start making these financial decisions that changed the diversity conversation. And it was as if they forgot about the diverse environments they came from. This morning, I was shared something on Facebook about a neighborhood in Chicago called Logan Square, where right now the landowners have sued the city because they plan to build 100 affordable housing units right next to the Blue Line train stop. And they said that it will cause irreparable harm to the neighborhood to build affordable housing. That's an economic war that has a racial lens to it. But that's not what the capitalist says. The capitalist says it's a market opportunity. I'm just trying to preserve home ownership rates and values. That economic argument often happens later in life when people have the ability to organize those economies and organize that level of wealth. And so I say all of that to say, I have hope in generations until they start accumulating things. And then once they start accumulating things, their politic changes, and their demand for diversity changes, and their rationalization for the choices they make sound like what they were supposed to be replacing. Thank you.
Thank you, Xavier. As you know well, Rotary has been a world leader in our efforts to eradicate polio throughout the world. So in honor of your presentation today, we're going to donate to Rotary International to purchase 50 more doses of the vaccine to get us that much closer to a polio-free world. We're also going to give you one of our treasured connecting mugs. You probably don't have those down in your club, but we'll have one for you here today. So go out and do some good in the world this week. This meeting is adjourned.